Buenos dias. I apologize for my poor language skills. I have to address you in English. It's a great honor being here together with you. We are blessed by Mother Nature, the rain that Guilherme was mentioning. We are blessed by each other's presence, coming together here, not only as individuals, but as part of a larger movement. And we are blessed by being alive on this planet right now, where so much is at stake. Never before we were in a situation where the decisions of what people alive on the planet, what they rise up to in order to do or not to do, has such a profound impact on the future of the planet and the future of our children and their children, the next generations. So it's actually a great privilege to be alive and to be able to step into this moment and to rise to the occasion and to make the difference that we can make in our own sphere of influence. You all know that not all is well. So we live in a very difficult time. Yes, there's a lot of inspiration, but there is also, particularly over the past few years, a lot of challenges that are arising that we are all dealing with. I'm coming from the land of Trump. You have your own version of it here in the region, right? And we live in a moment where our house and our home is on fire. So this is, I believe, in many ways, the moment that we have been waiting for. So this is kind of when leadership really matters. Change-making, is easy when everything is going normal. But when disruption happens, then it's really that we need to rise to the occasion. We need to wake up to our true purpose, to our true awareness that we have, not only as individuals, but also together as a community. So this image you see here from my colleague and artist, Kelvie Bird, is a depiction of what I believe is the essence of the current moment that we live in, which is that we live in a moment of disruption. And what does disruption mean? Disruption means that the future will be very different from the past and the present moment we are living in. So when we are here and current reality is here and the emerging future is there, then we know a lot about current reality. We know less about the emerging future, but we know least about how to move from here to there. And that's what I would like to talk to you a little bit about, because I believe that, when you look at this challenge, how do we respond to disruption, which is a challenge we each face as individuals, as organizations, as societies, and as a global community. The perspective that Theory U is taking on that challenge is that the future is already here. It's already, and we can feel that here in Mendoza, right? So the seeds of the future, of the future society that we need to create are already here. But in order to connect more fully with them, we need to go on an outer journey that takes us to the edges of the system, but also on an inner journey that allows us to connect to the deeper sources of knowing. And that's what I would like to talk a little bit about. And the questions that the organizers put to me for my upfront remarks, for your 3 days here is, what actually does it mean to be systemic in our current time? Because often, like also corporate social responsibility, has a bad name right now, because it's just kind of greenwashing things which in substance are still moving us in the wrong direction. So I want to come back to that question, but first talk about, so I started with disruption happens. And the next observation I want to share with you is, okay, what are the responses that we see to disruption? The responses that we come up with as organizations, as society, as individuals. And I happen to believe that across all countries I have been visiting, we see the same three responses. The first one is downloading, which means same old, same old. So you continue what you are already doing. And we know that's no longer an option, right? So that's clear to everyone. So there are two more responses that therefore, by the hour, right, become more and more important. Number one, turning back. So turning backwards in order to make ... great again, right? Basically orienting yourself in the past, right? And the Trump phrase, make America great again. The most important word is the again, because it means you orient yourself in the past. So that's kind of the second response. And it is based on ignorance, hate and anger and fear. So that's kind of the strategy, kind of that's being deployed and amplified. And the second response is, or the third response is, leaning into the emerging future by activating our curiosity, compassion, and courage. So those are the two responses that we see. So when we face disruption, there are fundamentally two different ways how we can respond. One is by freezing our mind, right? Closing the mind, freezing and closing the heart, and freezing and closing the will, which leads to ignorance, hate, and fear. So that's kind of when we turn away, when we turn backwards. And when we manage to lean forward, to turn towards the emerging future that we don't know what it is, then we open the mind, open the heart, open the will, which means we have to activate curiosity, compassion, and courage. So those are the two fundamental reactions whenever we face disruption that we can engage in. And sometimes we manage to lean into something that we don't know by opening the mind, opening the heart, but sometimes it's just too much. And what happens to us kind of leads to a freeze reaction, right? Kind of where we move, where we are thrown into the other space. So in my view, the phenomenon of Bolsonaro and of Trumpism is a result of two forces. One is disruption happens. And the second one is our lack of capacity to access these deeper sources of knowing. The open mind, the open heart, the open will. And if you face disruption, you do not have developed these skills as a community or as an individual. You are thrown into that upper space. So that's kind of what we see playing out, and that's where I think our intervention point should be, right? Because we need to, what we see today, kind of we all come together here because we are co-creating this world. That's kind of one big narrative today. But then we also see the other narrative going on. And, when you look, so that's, when you look into the public conversation today, this is what, takes out all the oxygen of the public conversation. It's dominating our awareness and our consciousness because it's super amplified by two main forces. One is dark money, right? The climate denial industry, for example, in the US. And the other one is the surveillance capitalism. It is kind of a business model coming out of Silicon Valley that is basically maximizing user engagement by activating hate, anger, and fear. That creates for $1 trillion business and, you know, the biggest companies on earth, while also ruining our democracy and the foundations of our society. So if you want to read more about that, there's like probably the most important book this year, Surveillance Capitalism, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, who goes into great detail about that. So this is kind of the world we live in, and part of our change, I think, part of our challenge is, so as I said, two narratives in the world. This narrative and this narrative, two ways of responding to disruption. But what we are lacking is, on this side, an amplification mechanism. On this side, we have the social media that every day is amplifying kind of all the messaging here. Here, we have a lack of an amplification mechanism. And this calls for innovation in new learning infrastructures, in new democratic infrastructures, and innovations for infrastructures for a new economy. And that's basically what's bringing us together here. So systems thinking is basically starts with a very simple distinction, which is the distinction between symptoms at the top and root issues at the bottom, which includes the structures, the paradigms of thought, and the deeper sources of creativity and inspiration and knowing. So when we look at the symptoms at the top, we see kind of three main domains of problems today: the ecological divide, the social divide, and the spiritual divide. By which I mean the disconnect between self and nature, the disconnect between self and other, and the disconnect between self and self. So when you look historically, this is kind of the problem of inequality, right? The whole environmental issues, where did the environmental movement start, right? Rachel Carson, The Silent Spring, some 50 plus years ago. It's really about how the unintended impact of technology on the outer nature. And what happens today is that we see the unintended impact of technology on our inner nature, on the human mind. That's kind of the 21st century version of that problem. So these are kind of the three main issues that we deal with and we need to be aware of as we are moving forward. So what is systemic? Systemic is everything that helps us bridging these divides. If we do something that is not improving the most vulnerable people, the well-being of the most vulnerable people in our community, it's not systemic. We can just talk about everything social, it's not systemic. If we do something that is not increasing the well-being of our kind of ecological ecosystems, it's not systemic. If we do something that is not increasing the choices and possibilities of future generations, it is not systemic. You know this, of course, right? The SDGs, so they can be grouped according to these three categories. The social, the first 10 focusing on the social divide, the next 5 on the ecological divide, and the last 2 on the spiritual divide. So how is it then? So that would be kind of my first definition of what is systemic, right? Systemic is what helps us to bridge the three divides. Anything we do that is not helping us to do that is just hot air. It's just noise. And there is a lot of noise, including on corporate social responsibility. So the second criteria, I would say, is that we need a process, right? So how do we do that, right? How do we have that impact? We need a process that takes us out of downloading and moves us through the stages of observe, 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 by which I mean going to the edges of the system, the deeper sources of knowing, accessing the deeper source of knowing, and then, learning by doing, kind of design thinking. So that was one thing that we learned, that it takes to bring multi-stakeholder groups together, to work together in a more effective way. The second thing that we learned is that to do that well, you need to engage in some inner leadership work. And the moment I learned that was with talking with practitioners, and this is one example, the late CEO of Hanover Insurance, who said that the success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. So that means in order to be effective as change makers, it's not only important what we do, and it's not only important how we do it, but what matters is the inner place from that we operate. And what I mean by inner place today is really the capacity that we have to connect to these three inner sources of knowing: the open mind, the open heart, and the open will. And what we also know is that this is often very challenging. Why is it challenging? Because the moment you put yourself on a journey to move from downloading old habits of thought and of action towards connecting to the deeper sources of knowing, the moment you put yourself on that journey, we are going to face three, as an American I would say, enemies. As a European I would say three inner sources of resistance, which are the voice of judgment, the voice of cynicism, and the voice of fear. So those are the things that, if they prompt our actions, basically throws us into this upper realm. Right? That's basically the challenge that we have. So let me sum up. I started with the question, what does it take to engage in a world that's largely driven by these dynamics? What does it take for us as a change maker to engage these dynamics? Because that's the reality we are living in. Otherwise, we are pre-2016, right? We live in the past. How do we engage these forces? By activating this deeper space, not only in our projects, but as an entire ecosystem. And what I'm basically saying is, leverage points is, as an individual, realign attention and intention. Because energy follows attention. And when our attention is just reacting to the bad stuff, we are amplifying this. So our attention needs to where our intention is, which is creating this kind of world. So that's kind of the first thing I'm saying. And the second one is, to do that in groups, we need social technologies, awareness-based social technologies, and that's where the U process and Theory U tries to make a contribution towards. Because we need to go on a journey, an outer journey, but also an inner journey. And as I indicated before. And the last one is, we need to actually create new infrastructures. New infrastructures of learning, of democracy, making learning more whole person, whole system, making democracies more direct, more distributed, and more dialogic. And we need, of course, new economic infrastructures, right, which allow us to create well-being for all. And I want to, so on these kind of economic infrastructures and how we evolve, our operating system, and that's kind of my last criteria. So what I said is, so what is systemic? So I started with the question, what is systemic? And I said, systemic is what's bridging the three divides, right? That's the first main answer. But the second main answer is, systemic is what allows us to create these new infrastructures, to basically upgrade the operating system of our society, of our various sectors. And I want to show you a few examples, because when I look at that from a systems perspective, I see across all sectors the same development. And I'm sure you will recognize that. So so the operating system 1.0 is basically input and authority-centric. So when you look at learning, that is traditional teacher-centric. When you look at health, this is kind of doctor-centric medicine. 2.0, so that was the past. Current is this, output and efficiency focus. So that means kind of teaching for testing, right? Also known as bulimia learning, fast in, fast out, or evidence-based medicine. So you really kind of, look at the efficiency and look at the research-driven results. What's the next thing we see in systems evolution? 3.0 means outcome-centric and user-centric, which means student-centric architectures of learning and patient-centric architectures of health. That's the good hospital, the good school today. Is that the future? No. It's not good enough. Because I believe the future and what brings all of us together is the 4.0 co-creative ecosystem way of operating, which means activating the deeper sources of knowing, right? Whole, head, heart, and hand, whole person, whole systems learning, and which means moving away from reacting against symptoms towards, reacting against or treating symptoms of sickness towards activating the sources of health. All right, so that's kind of where, of course, we need to look at the entire society. What do we see in farm and food? Exactly the same thing. Farmer-centric, the old one. The current one is industrial agriculture, which is the #2 climate polluter today. So that's kind of after energy. That's the highest polluting sector, almost nowhere really addressed. So half of all our environmental problems come from this sector. 3.0, organic agriculture and sustainable agriculture, reducing the negative externalities, the negative impact. That's good. We do less of the bad things. No pesticides, kind of no monocultures and so on. Is it good enough? No. Because the future is food as medium for healing planet and people. So that's kind of, I think, kind of where we need to go, and that would mean kind of an ecosystem approach towards that. Corporate social responsibility and sustainability in companies. 1.0, it's just PR, right? It's just something we do, to look good, kind of to basically greenwash things. So that's maybe a beginning, but not the real thing. #2 is we apply the corporate social responsible and sustainability principles to our processes. Now we have recycling, we have like energy efficiency, kind of, so that's the step forward, but it's still limited because it's not transforming our core business. So 3.0 would be transforming its business innovation, transforming our core business. For example, in the mobility industry, in the car industry, right? That would be now I move from combustion engine to electric vehicle, right? To electric vehicles. That's good. That's a business innovation. Does it solve the problem of sustainable mobility? No, not at all. Because sustainable mobility is something that needs kind of a much deeper systemic approach. Why is it we are living here and working there, right? It has to do with urban planning, with lots of other systemic questions. So the 4.0 really is linking sustainability with the purpose, with the mission of the company, mission-driven enterprises, like a new breed of companies that is emerging, and many of the entrepreneurs of that being in this room. Lastly, the evolution of capitalism, because at the end of the day, of course, systemic means we need to evolve the system. That means democracy and capitalism, right? What is it? So all modern economy is based on division of labor. That comes with a coordination problem, right? So how are we coordinating the whole? And so 1.0 is we have, in the past, we have come up with 3 responses to how to solve that problem. One is the visible hand, right? It's basically hierarchy and state, right? In mercantilism, kind of in socialism, that's kind of the old way of, top-down coordinating the system. The next one is the invisible hand of the market, right? So that's kind of led to a lot of growth, but also to a lot of externalities because of the environmental and the social issues and so on, which leads to 3.0, which is organized interest groups. So now we have kind of better regulatory frameworks, we have environmental movements, social movements, and so on, but we are also, because of all the organized vested interests, we are currently hitting the wall. What we see today is that this model that served us well in the last century is no longer working in the face of our current challenges. So therefore, one of the most important things that happens today in the world is the birth of a 4th coordination mechanism, which I call ABC, awareness-based collective action. And who is at the forefront of these new, which basically means bringing all the stakeholders together and going through a process of sensing what's going on, a deep understanding, identifying leverage points, understanding the root issues, and then identifying leverage points for change. So it's basically kind of what happens here in Mendoza and in other kind of related cities, kind of because in place-based communities you see this coordination mechanism come together first, because that's where it's the most common sense. So with that, so let me step back and wrap up here. What do we see here? We see that today we often respond to 4.0 challenges by activating mechanism from 1.0, 2.0, or 3.0. Usually it's 2.0 or 3.0. But, to truly have systems impact, we need to go to 4.0. And of course, I'm not saying anything new here. 4.0 is a lot related to indigenous ways of organizing, of kind of indigenous wisdom and other wisdom traditions, but we need to bring them together with science and, teaching all the stakeholders to operate in new ways. So this would be kind of my last criteria for what it means to be systemic. So let me step back. So I started with the question, what does it mean to have systemic impact? And what I was basically saying is, to have systemic impact, right, there's kind of one simple set of criteria that you can use, which is, does it help the most vulnerable people? Yes or no? That's something very easy to check in every single community. Does it help our kind of ecological ecosystems? And does it help the future generations? So that's the first set of criteria. That's one way of, in a very kind of applicable way, validate and assess whether or not you have systemic impact. And the second one is, are we actually evolving our operating system? Because what drives our systemic impact means we need to go beyond just doing good things and doing more of that. We need to change how the operating system of our economy and of our democracy is working. And we need to change it from basically ecosystem awareness to ecosystem awareness, by which I mean an awareness that is focusing on well-being for all. And for these 4.0 ways of operating, we need new innovations and infrastructures in our learning systems, in our democratic systems, but also in our economic systems. So that's, I would say, kind of the other set of criteria. Are we, as a movement, because we are together here as a movement, we have a massive transformation ahead of us. Together, there's no limit of what we can reach. But what we need to focus on, the other thing is to move the operating system to 4.0. That means to an ecosystem approach where we bring human intelligence into the governance of our system and not just let that be run by markets and by hierarchies. Thank you very much.